When the EEOC actually receives a charge of discrimination and it comes in, they'll immediately categorize in one of three different ways. A C claim is one where the charging party or the plaintiff has either stated something that's untimely or a violation that's not covered by the law or some other problem with it. They'll immediately dismiss those. A charges, or A claims, as they're described here, is ones from the very face of them seem to be a huge issue. For instance, if an African American employee were to complain that they had a noose placed on their desk, that, for instance, is one issue the EEOC takes very, very seriously. They're not going to offer you all mediation, and typically the EEOC may come after you all very heavily. And most of the claims out of those, for instance, 95,000 claims last year, probably 75 to 80% of them fall into B claims. That meaning from the face of them, you don't know which way they're going to go. And mediation is typically offered by the EEOC. I just spoke with the district director of the Tampa-Orlando area EEOC director, and he said that the Obama administration has just given them a lot of funding to hire additional investigators under the stimulus funds. I jokingly told him that nothing says stimulus to the economy quite like an EEOC investigation. He didn't laugh, but I did. What that means for you all is the EEOC is going to be far more aggressive, so keep an eye out for these types of things. Now, let's move on to some of the more meaty advice as far as the life cycle of employment. First, let's talk about interviewing. I think the most important advice I can give any employer to avoid employment litigation is to hire the right employees. Now, I know that's easier said than done. Here's my advice, and then let's talk about what the law is, and then let's talk about what my practical advice is. The first thing you should do when you're going to interview folks for a job, the first thing you need to do before you post a notice in the paper or post something internally for, candidates want to transfer into a position, the very first thing you need to do is you need to sit down. Number one is figure out what the position requires, and then figure out what qualities the applicant would need to be successful in the position. It is impossible to hire the right employee if you don't know what you're looking for. So I always recommend employers sit down and do that. Get a job description, figure out what's important for the position, and then take a look at that before you start interviewing. The next thing you do is once you do post for the job and you receive resumes, actually read these. I can't tell you how many employers I run into who never read the whole application. They may look at something on there and say, oh, wow, I have a pharmacy, and they used to work at CVS, so they're perfect for the job. They don't read the entire application and find out that, Jane spent 15 years at Rikers Island because she, stabbed her last employer. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but the reality is oftentimes the application will tell you a lot about the applicant. Read the entire thing. Also, I'm sure many of you all have received applications before where somebody hasn't answered every question on there. Typically, when people don't answer questions on application, that means either they have a really hard time following directions, or B, they don't want you to know the answer. And typically when they don't want you to know the answer, it's something that would disqualify them or make them less likely to be hired by you all. So it's very important that you read the application, and if there's something that's not filled out, you're going to want to follow up with the applicant to find out what the answer to the question is. Either reject the application and have them fill it out, or it's something you could ask in an interview. The other thing is I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of applications. Candidly, most people's applications stink. Employers go on a lot of misconceptions that they can only ask certain things. Let's say, for instance, you're just a Florida employer. If your application just says, have you ever been convicted of a felony, you're making a huge mistake. In Florida, you can actually ask them if they've been arrested or pled no contest or charged with a misdemeanor. Normally, the only thing you don't want to know about is a minor traffic infraction. If you only ask if they've been convicted of a felony, you're making a huge mistake. Candidly, you might end up hiring O.J. Simpson. He wasn't convicted of a felony. Obviously, he was probably somebody you wouldn't want to hire. So in Florida, at least, and there are other states that differ, the reality is you you can absolutely ask additional information about their arrest record. Also, I'm a firm believer in doing background checks on employees. I think you're making a huge mistake if you don't do everything you can to find out whether or not the employee has a criminal background. A lot of employers don't do a proper criminal background search, and what I mean by that is, well, let's say they're applying for a job in Orlando. They'll just check in Orlando, and their Orlando record's clear, so they think this employee's never been arrested. Well, they may have only lived in Orlando for 6 months, and they may have lived in, I don't know, Clearwater for 15 years. It would be important to find out if they had a record there as well. You also want to find out where else they've lived, so you can check those jurisdictions. Many employers use third parties to do criminal background checks. I'm fine with those third parties. Just make sure you're going through a reputable one that's going to do a good, safe, thorough job, and that you also make sure they comply with something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act if you're going to use a third party to do a criminal investigation. Notice in hiring the right employees, we haven't even gotten to the actual interview yet. I think there's another thing you need to do before you go in there. I think you also need to write down a list of questions that you want to know the answer to. The most important advice I can give you about interviewing is only ask questions you need to know the answer to. Believe it or not, the only unlawful, per se unlawful question you can ask in an interview is if somebody has a disability. So technically you could ask somebody's religion or if they're single or if they have children, but those aren't questions you'd ever want to ask because you don't need to know the answer. So the bottom line is only ask questions that you need to know the answer to during an interview, and make sure you write those questions down. I highly recommend you follow up on things that you might have some confusion about or questions about from the application. I've been through plenty of interviews in my life. I've heard people ask some, sort of off-the-wall questions like, if you were an animal, what type of animal would you be, or what's your best and worst quality? I'll defer to you all if you think that's a good question to ask. I've always thought that stuff was a little silly. I just think that you really want to get to know who the person is, how they performed in their past jobs, and why they think they'd be a good fit for the job you're offering to them. After an interview or once you receive that application, a lot of people don't check references. I still believe you check references. Now, most of you all say, well, it's an utter waste of time because employers or past employers never answer questions. One of the tricks of the trade is oftentimes employers will answer the question whether or not the employee is eligible for rehire. If the employer says no, they're not, then you know one of two things. Either they were fired for some sort of cause type reason, or in the alternative, they haven't give proper notice. I've noticed a lot of people don't write down all of the employers they worked at because they don't want you to know about the ones who fired them or they left under bad terms. So when you look at that application, make sure, even though they've given you the references of the the three good people, they're going to say nice things about them. You also want to know who else is out there that might not say some nice things about them. So, for instance, if you see gaps of employment, that's something you should also ask about. Why do you have a 6-month gap in employment? Or your dates here don't match a transition between jobs. Now, a lot of people are going to have gaps in employment because the economy is not in great shape and it's hard to find a job, but it does not hurt for you to still ask that question and see what you can find out.